The scream cut through the Wyoming wilderness like a knife. Eli Walker froze, the rasp of his file going silent in his hand. The sound didn't belong to the mountains or the pines or the rushing wind river. It was human, high, sharp, terrified. For a moment, he thought it was another ghost from his past, a memory from a war that still woke him at night with cold sweat soaking his skin. But then it came again, weaker this time, almost swallowed by the roar of the swollen river. Eli dropped his tools and ran. His long legs pounded across the rough ground as he scanned the water. The peaceful river he'd lived beside for 3 years was gone. In its place churned a wild brown beast, full of broken branches and racing snowmelt, chewing at the banks like it wanted to eat the whole valley. And then he saw her, a woman, half submerged, clinging to the broken limbs of a fallen cottonwood tree that was being hammered by the current. Her dark hair was plastered to her face. Her dress was torn, the fabric heavy with water, dragging her down. One arm wrapped desperately around a thick branch while the river tried to rip her away. Her leg looked trapped beneath the water. Her head dipped under, then came back up, barely staying above the rushing foam. Eli didn't think. He didn't plan. He didn't pray. He moved. He kicked off his boots, ripped off his gun belt, and dove into the freezing river. The shock of the cold hit him like a punch to the chest. The current yanked at him instantly, pulling him under, slamming debris into his ribs and shoulders. He fought it with every ounce of strength he had left from a life built on survival. When he reached the cottonwood, his fingers burned from the cold. He grabbed a thick limb to steady himself and reached for her arm. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar. She didn't answer. Her eyes were half closed, her face pale as winter sky. She was slipping away. Her leg was wedged deep between 2 branches underwater, caught in the tree's twisted roots. Eli sucked in a breath and went under. The current shoved him sideways. Mud blinded his eyes. He groped with numb fingers, fighting the river's pull, and finally freed her foot with a violent wrench that nearly tore his shoulder from its socket. They resurfaced together, gasping. She was limp in his arms, her body slack with exhaustion and cold. "Stay with me," he growled through clenched teeth. It wasn't a request. It was a command from a soldier who had dragged dying men off battlefields and refused to let death win. Fighting the river with her weight, dragging him down, was like fighting 10 wars at once. But slowly, painfully, step by agonizing step, he got them to shore. He collapsed onto the mud beside her, chest heaving, arms shaking. For a long second, she didn't move, and fear clawed up his throat. Then she coughed, a harsh, painful sound that felt like a miracle. Her eyes opened, moss green, foggy with fear and pain. "You're safe," Eli said, breathless. She flinched away from his voice, scrambling weakly backward, even though she could barely sit upright. Her dress was ruined, ripped open at the shoulder, clinging to her body in a way that made her wrap her arms around her chest in shame. "Where am I?" she whispered, voice raw. "Wind River country," he said, keeping his distance, his tone careful. "My land." "You're not taking me to town," she said suddenly, fear sharpening her voice like broken glass. "Please, not town." Her terror didn't make sense, but Eli wasn't a man who forced anyone into anything. The war had taught him what happened when power met cruelty. "I'm not taking you anywhere but somewhere warm," he said simply. "You'll die out here." She tried to stand. Her legs gave out. Eli caught her before she hit the ground, his arm steadying her gently. She stiffened in his grip, but didn't fight him. He carried her all the way to his cabin, feeling her shiver against his chest like a wounded bird. Inside, the single room was warm from the fire. He never let go out. He set her gently in the chair closest to the hearth and tossed more wood on the flames. Sparks flew upward like tiny stars. "Get those wet clothes off," he said, turning away to give her privacy. His tone wasn't rough, just practical. "There's a blanket on the cot." She froze. Her voice shook. "I will not be a bother. As soon as my clothes dry, I'll go." "You ain't going anywhere," he said, glancing at the window where rain had started hammering the glass. Rivers too high. Storms coming harder. The silence was thick. Fire crackling. Her breath trembling. The storm outside pressing against the walls like a living thing trying to get in. Eli made coffee and added a generous splash of whiskey to warm her from the inside. He set the cup beside her and busied himself with checking his rifle, cleaning his knife, anything to give her space to breathe. When he finally looked at her again, she was wrapped in a spare wool blanket, her wet dress hanging near the fire. Her cheek was bruised, purple blooming along her jawline. Her hands trembled around the cup. Her eyes stared into flames as if something terrible lived inside them. "My name is Eli Walker," he said quietly. She lifted her gaze. For the first time, without the edge of fear, she looked at him. Really looked. "Clara Jensen," she whispered. They drank in silence. Firelight danced across her tired face, catching in her wet hair, making shadows move across the rough cabin walls. When she finally spoke again, her voice was thin and fragile as spider silk. "My husband passed not long ago," she said. "He left debts, bad ones. Men came for the land, said it belonged to them now." She swallowed hard, her throat working against tears. "I ran. I didn't know the river was so high. My horse threw me near the rapids. I thought I was going to—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Eli didn't ask questions. He understood danger. He understood running. His own past was full of things he'd fled from, ghosts that still found him in the dark. The night deepened. Rain drummed the roof like 1,000 fingers. She grew quiet, exhausted, her body folding inward with the weight of everything she'd survived that day. Eli laid out his bedroll, on the floor near the door. "You take the cot," he said. She hesitated, then nodded, too tired to argue. But as the fire dimmed and shadows grew long across the room, her voice came from the darkness, small and broken. "Mr. Walker?" He didn't turn. "What is it?" A long pause. Her breathing shaky, uneven. "Will you stay if I undress?" The words hit him like a hammer to the chest. A raw, broken offer. An echo of fear and shame in a life he didn't yet understand. An expectation that kindness always had a price. Eli stared hard at the dying coals, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. His voice came out low, rough, and final. "No one is bothering you here," he said. "Get some sleep?" Behind him, she let out a quiet, choked sob she tried to hide, and Eli Walker lay awake, staring at the fire, knowing the river had washed more than one kind of storm into his life that night. The morning light crept into the cabin slowly, pale and cold. Eli Walker was already up, leaning against the doorframe as he stared at the river. It had calmed some overnight, but not enough for anyone to cross safely. Debris still tumbled past in the brown water, logs spinning like driftwood in an angry sea. He didn't hear Clara stir, but he felt it, the shift in her breathing, the soft rustle of the blanket, the quiet dread settling between them like a thick fog. Neither knew how to navigate. When she finally rose from the cot, she moved stiffly, favoring her right leg. Her limp was worse in daylight. Her eyes were red, not from sleep, but from tears she tried to hide in the darkness. "The river's still too high," Eli said without turning around. "I see that," she said quietly. She dressed in silence behind the blanket he'd strung up for her privacy. Then she stepped outside into the cool morning air and began working in his small garden without being asked. Her limp slowed her, but it didn't stop her. Eli told her she didn't have to, but she only said, "It's better than sitting." Days passed like this. Slow, quiet, heavy. They shared the cabin, but not their thoughts. They cooked together, ate together, did chores together, but still lived like two strangers who shared the same ghost-filled room. Yet Eli watched her more than he admitted. He saw the scars on her back one afternoon when her dress shifted as she hung laundry outside. Thin, pale lines like someone had dragged fire across her skin. Whip marks, belt marks, the unmistakable map of cruelty. He turned away quickly, jaw clenched, fists tight at his sides. He knew what scars like that meant. He'd seen them on soldiers, on prisoners, on the broken. He said nothing. Not yet. Clara, too, watched him in her quiet way. She noticed how he never raised his voice, even when frustrated, how he flinched at sudden noises, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, How he woke at night sometimes, breath fast, eyes sharp and distant, haunted by things a war had carved into soul, like words into stone. Two wounded souls circling each other in a tiny wooden cabin, both afraid to reach out, both afraid to be reached. On the third day, Eli walked inside and found Clara sitting at the table, her shoulders shaking. She held a small silver locket in her trembling hands, staring at it like it held the weight of the world. He recognized grief when he saw it. It looked like his own face in the mirror most mornings. He made a noise with his boot on purpose, so she wouldn't feel ambushed. She straightened quickly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "It's nothing," she said, voice tight. "Just a foolish memory." He didn't push. Her pain was hers to give, not his to take. But later, as twilight settled over the valley, he heard her whisper softly to the locket as she tucked it beneath her pillow. He had his father's eyes. Eli's chest tightened. He understood then. She'd lost more than a husband. That night, things changed. A rider appeared across the valley just before sunset. Jed, a ranch hand from the spread Eli sometimes worked for. Clara stiffened when she saw him through the window, fear shooting through her like lightning splitting a tree. Jed brought trouble with him. He always did. "There's talk in town," Jed warned, sitting his horse outside while Eli stood in the doorway. His eyes flicked past Eli toward the cabin. "About her?" Eli's jaw tightened. "What talk?" Jed shifted uneasily in his saddle. "They're saying the widow Jensen ain't no widow, that her husband died in a brawl over cards, and she ran off with money that wasn't hers." Inside, Clara flinched like she'd been struck. Jed kept talking, digging the knife deeper. "Amos Jensen, her husband's brother, is telling folks she stole from the family. Sheriff seems to believe him. They're fixing to look for her." Jed didn't stay long. When he rode off, he left dust and fear behind him like a poison in the air. Inside, Clara stood with her arms wrapped around her body, shaking hard enough that Eli could see it from across the room. "He's right," she whispered. "Amos, he hates me. He always did. He wants what little I saved. He'll lie to get it." Eli leaned against the doorframe, watching her carefully. "What aren't you telling me?" Her voice cracked open like a wound that had never healed. "My husband, Silas, he wasn't a good man. He drank. He gambled. And when he lost, he took it out on me." She lifted her chin, but her eyes filled with tears that spilled over despite her effort to hold them back. "I saved pennies. A few dollars over the years, hidden where he couldn't find them. It was all I had for me, for my baby." She swallowed hard, fighting the words. He was born too early. He didn't live past his first sunrise. And Silas blamed me. Amos blamed me, too. Said I was cursed. Eli felt something dark and violent coil inside him. A rage so deep it made his hands shake. Not at her. Never at her. At the men who had broken her and called it her fault. Clara stared at the floor, her voice barely a whisper now. "I wasn't his legal wife. We were married by a traveling preacher on the trail, but Silas never filed the papers. I have no rights to anything. Not the land. Not the money I saved. Nothing." There it was, the whole truth, shaking in her voice like a house in a windstorm. She expected disgust. She expected pity. She expected him to tell her to leave. Instead, Eli spoke with a low rumble of distant thunder. Promises are just words. Most men never keep them. He finally told her about his brother, Samuel. How the boy had lied about his age to join the Union Army, only to die of fever in a camp far from home before he ever saw a battle. How Eli came back from the war to find his fiancée married to another man, a man with money and no scars. "We both lost things," he said quietly, his voice rough with old pain. "Too much." That night, Clara's fever hit hard. By midnight, she was burning up, tossing the cot, whispering things that didn't make sense. Names Eli didn't recognize. Apologies to people who weren't there. Pleas for mercy from ghosts only she could see. Eli stayed by her side the whole night, bathing her forehead with cool water, cooling her wrists, speaking to her when she cried out in the darkness. Just before dawn, She grabbed his hand, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "You're the only one," she murmured, her voice thick with fever. "The only one who ever touched me without wanting something." The words broke something wide open inside him, a wall he'd built around his heart after too many betrayals, too many losses. He couldn't sleep after that. The weight of her trust pressed on him like a stone he wanted to carry, but didn't know if he was strong enough. When dawn came, Clara slept peacefully for the first time since she'd arrived. Eli stepped outside to breathe, to think, to feel the cool morning air on his face. The river had begun to calm. The water was still high, but passable now. Soon she would be able to leave. The thought of her leaving felt like a knife sliding between his ribs. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw her walking toward him through the cool morning air, barefoot, wrapped in his old army coat, the fabric swaying around her knees. Her hair was loose and wild, catching the early light. Her eyes were clear and searching, no longer clouded with fever or fear. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. "Eli," she said softly, "can I stay a little longer?" It wasn't the river asking. It was her heart. He couldn't trust his voice, so he only nodded, and that was a moment their lonely worlds began to turn toward each other, like two stars caught in the same gravity, unable to pull away even if they tried. Clara stayed. Days slipped into a quiet rhythm in the little cabin by the Wind River. She cooked, cleaned, tended the garden, and mended Eli's clothes with careful stitches. Eli worked the land, fixed the fences, chopped the wood, and watched her from the corner of his eye more than he meant to. Their lives brushed together in small ways. A shared cup of coffee in the morning, steam rising between them, a quiet smile when she handed him his coat, accidental touches that felt like lightning strikes, quick and electric, leaving them both rattled. But the river wasn't done with them yet. Neither were the ghosts of Clara's past. One hot afternoon, Clara borrowed Eli's horse, Drum. She wanted to feel the wind again, she said, to remember what freedom felt like. Eli watched her ride away with a tight feeling in his chest, something like hope wrapped in fear. Then he heard it, a scream, the terrified cry of a horse in pain. He ran, heart slamming against his ribs, legs burning. He found Drum tangled in brush at the bottom of a shallow ravine, and Clara half buried in the loose dirt of a collapsed bank. She was pushing herself up, shaking, dirt in her hair and on her face. "Clara!" he shouted, sliding down the slope. He grabbed her shoulders, his hands running over her arms and back, checking desperately for broken bones. "Are you hurt?" "I'm all right," she whispered, but her voice trembled. Eli wasn't all right. The fear shook him harder than the river ever had. Without thinking, without permission, he pulled her against him, crushing her to his chest like he could hold her together through sheer will. She melted into him. Her arms circled his waist, her face buried in his shirt. They stood like that, two battered souls holding each other as if the world was falling apart around them. When he finally lifted her chin, their faces were inches apart, breaths mixing, hearts pounding so loud he could hear hers, or maybe it was his own. He couldn't tell anymore. He leaned in, almost kissed her, but then he saw something in her eyes. Not just desire. Something deeper. Something broken. The woman who had whispered on that first night, "Will you stay if I undress?" He stepped back. The moment shattered like glass. Clara's heart broke a little. She could feel it crack inside her chest. That night, she stood before him in the cabin, her jaw set, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "You saved me," she said. "You care for me, but you never let me thank you." Eli stared at her, his knife frozen mid-stroke over the piece of wood he'd been carving. Then, slowly, painfully, she unbuttoned the old army shirt she wore. "Will you stay this time?" she whispered. The shirt slipped from her shoulders and fell to floor. She stood before him in her thin shift, the firelight painting her skin gold, her old scars faint and silver like rivers on a map of pain. This time it wasn't trade. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was a woman asking to be seen, wanted, chosen. Eli crossed the room in two long strides. His hands came up to her face, gentle and trembling. "I want you," he said, voice raw and honest. but not because you owe me anything." Her face crumpled. A tear slid down her cheek, then another, and the truth spilled out of her like water from a broken dam. Her husband's cruelty, the beatings that left her unable to stand some mornings, the baby she lost because of him, the shame she carried like a stone around her neck, the small bag of money she'd saved, hidden in the lining of her one good dress, planning her escape for years before she finally found the courage to run. She sobbed into Eli's chest, shaking apart in his arms, and he held her through all of it. When she finished, Eli whispered against her hair, his voice fierce and certain, "That does not make you less. It makes you braver than any man I ever knew. What happened next wasn't desperate. It wasn't payment. It wasn't pity. It was healing, slow, tender, and filled with a lifetime of pain finally finding a home in each other's arms." But peace never lasts long in the West. 2 days later, a ranch hand arrived with news that sent ice through Clara's veins. Amos Jensen, her cruel brother-in-law, was in Lander stirring trouble and accusing Clara of theft. Eli took her to town to clear her name. The sheriff didn't believe her. He called her a liar, a thief, a woman of bad reputation. Eli pulled her out of that office before he put a hole in the lawman. They hid in an abandoned barn on the edge of town. And when Clara finally told Eli everything, every shameful secret, every moment of terror, he took her hand and pressed it to his chest. "If they want you, Clara," he said, voice low and dangerous, "they'll have to go through me first." That night, she kissed him with all the pieces of herself she thought were ruined, and he held her like every broken piece was gold. But at dawn, trouble found them. Amos and 2 hired guns burst into the boarding house where they had taken shelter. A fight broke out. Furniture shattered. Glass exploded. Eli killed 1 man in self-defense, but the second rushed him with a knife. Eli dodged once, twice, but the third strike sank deep into his ribs. He staggered backward, blood pouring dark and fast. Clara screamed. In that moment, something wild woke inside her. She grabbed Eli's fallen revolver with shaking hands, lifted it with both arms, aimed at the man who had stabbed him, and fired. The blast echoed through the hallway like thunder. The man dropped, howling, clutching his shoulder. Clara fell to her knees beside Eli, cradling his head in her lap, sobbing. "Don't leave me. Please, Eli, stay. Stay with me." Her tears fell on his face as the town judge arrived with the sheriff behind him. Amos was arrested. His hired man, too. Eli was carried away, bleeding but alive. Barely. Clara never left his side. Not for 1 minute. Through long nights of fever, she whispered him back from the nightmares of war. "You're here. You're safe. You're mine." And he always found her voice in the darkness. Weeks later, when he could finally stand again, he looked at her by the window, hair loose, eyes soft, a quiet courage in every breath she took. He said, "I want to wake up beside you every morning. If you'll have a cowboy with a scarred heart." Tears filled her eyes. "Only if you'll have a widow with too many ghosts." He kissed her long and deep, their promise sealed without fancy words or legal papers. They married under the cottonwood tree by the Wind River, the same river that nearly took her life. It became the place where she found a new one. Together, they built a home on a rise overlooking the valley, a home of warm light, hard work, and the kind of love that grows slow and strong, like pine roots gripping the mountainside. They healed each other, piece by piece, day by day. And on quiet evenings when the sun melted into gold behind the peaks, Clara would slip her hand into Eli's as they sat on the porch watching the river flow past. He'd look at her the way he did that first morning she asked to stay, the way a man looks when he has finally found peace. And she'd whisper, soft as a prayer, "Will you stay now?" Eli always smiled, always pulled her close. "I'm not going anywhere." The ghost didn't leave them completely, but they lived with them together. And for the first time in both their lives, they were truly finally home,